I'm going to pick computers next week. I pick computers.
Oh, thanks.
Computers are awesome.
Yeah, I use one on occasion.
You guys are all wrong. Technology is the best.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to episode 4 of the JavaScript Jabber Show. This week, we have with us Jeremy Ashkenas. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, that's pretty good.
That's pretty good. I like that. Passable. Anyway, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. I'm Jeremy, and I work at the interactive news team at the New York Times these days, right now mostly on our elections coverage. But in previous lives, you may know me from documentcloud.org, which was a Knight-funded news challenge project that ended up releasing a lot of open source code like Backbone.js, which might be one of the topics we cover today, and Underscore. And then I also have this fun little language called CoffeeScript that compiles into JavaScript. So my perspective is mostly working on, these days, news-oriented projects that have large JS components or are mostly done on the client side, and then trying to make that easier to accomplish.
Sounds interesting. So you're doing programming over there in some journalistic website?
So, I mean, yeah. So the interactive news is a team inside the newsroom that's sort of on a parallel with multimedia and graphics that are also newsroom teams at the Times. And so the kind of stuff that we do ranges from, apps for covering Gitmo detainees and how they're progressing through the system to right now, like I said before, mostly elections coverage of the Republican primary. So that's like the maps on the homepage that you see with the live results coming in from the AP and that sort of thing.
Oh, cool. All right. We also have on our panel a new panelist. That's Joaquin Larson. Do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm just, I go by Joe Developer, and that's basically kind of how I see myself. Just a run-of-the-mill developer, basically. I don't have a large GitHub profile. I just kind of work for clients and try to get their stuff running. I'm in really good company today. Jeremy Ashkenas, he's a really great guy. I hope we get to talk about the ICE. I saw the ICE library on GitHub recently, which I would imagine you're involved in.
I'm not actually. That's an upstairs thing, but it's an exciting step forward. So just for folks who didn't manage to see that, ICE was a sort of a track. If you've ever used Word and you have track changes where you can see from all the different people who edit a document who's added what and who's deleted what, it was an implementation of that for any content editable field so that you can use it in like a WordPress blog, for example. So I think they're thinking about using that for getting reporters and editors to be able to start on the web instead of starting in our CMS. For working on more web first stories.
Cool. Okay. Also on our panel we have AJ O'Neill.
Hey. Yep, I'm here. So for those of you that haven't heard me before, I am a employee at Spotter RF, which is actually a radar company, but we do some interesting things with our browser client and some of our internal apps with JavaScript, HTML5, and Node.js. And I've written the Futures library, if you've heard of that.
All right, cool. We also have Jameson Dance.
Hi, I'm Jameson Dance. I work at Spotter RF with AJ. So the things that he said also apply to me. And yeah, that's about it. I'm excited to be here.
All right. We also have Yehuda Katz.
Hey, Yehuda, I promised to try to have my audio better this week. Not really sure how.
He's in a smaller dungeon.
I'm in a smaller dungeon. I have a snowball. Hopefully it will be good. I work on a bunch of stuff, sort of the intersection of Ruby and JavaScript. These days, most of my time on open source is Ember stuff and Rails projects, Rails plugins that make it easier to work with client-side libraries.
All right, cool. And I'm Charles Maxwood from teachmetocode.com. And this week we're going to be talking about Backbone.js. So I don't know if there's a blood feud between Backbone and Ember, but it should be interesting to talk about. And I've actually been asking some of my friends about what they think about the two if they've used them both. And so I've gotten some insight on that. I still have yet to try Ember. I'm sorry, Yehuda.
It's okay. I should point out there was a couple of really good discussions that we had publicly in IRC this week, and we should definitely put them in the show, or last week, we should put them in the show notes, and people should read them. I mean, we'll probably have a good discussion here, but I feel like I think both, I don't want to speak for Jeremy, but I felt comfortable with people reading that and understanding what my position was. So,
yeah. All right, cool. Is there a good place to get that?
I think Jeremy posted a gist. He can, I'm sure, link to it in the room.
All right, yeah, we can provide the links.
All right, cool. So, Jeremy, why don't you go ahead and kind of explain what Backbone is and how it's intended to be used, and then we can kind of start picking apart what we like and don't like about it.
Sure thing. So Backbone.js is a library for helping out with client-side MVC. So this is when I think lots of us have this experience where you start building a JavaScript-heavy web app and you're trying to do lots of things on the client side. You're trying to do optimistic rendering and keep yourself on one page without having to use lots of page refreshes and make it feel more like an application than like a website. And there are many different ways to approach this, and that's actually one of the exciting things about seeing all these different JavaScript client-side libraries come out of the woodwork. But one of the single sort of things that you start to realize as you're doing this is you get yourself into a really big mess if you end up with pieces of state scattered all over the DOM, right? So maybe it's as simple as the number of people in this chat, in the Skype chat that we're having, or maybe it's some fancier kind of state with text and who's editing it. Whatever your state may be, if you end up with it scattered all over the DOM, your JavaScript gets really crazy. And whenever any state change happens, whenever something happens to the system, you make an update. You both have to, persist that change to the server back to your database so that it can be saved, and also update all the different pieces in the UI that might be looking at it. And this gets tricky, I think, mostly because it's so tempting with JavaScript and HTML to treat the document and the HTML as the source of truth and sort of use, because especially with jQuery, right? So jQuery is the most ubiquitous JavaScript library, and it has some data manipulation facilities like mapping and filtering, but basically it's querying against the DOM. And so because it's so good at querying against the DOM, it's really tempting to have all your data in the DOM and just look it up. And I think one of the first things you realize when you build one of these big apps is that you need to stop doing that. And you need to have a single source of data that your UI is just basically watching and reacting to changes in and rendering. And then when you want to have a rich model layer for working with that data and doing your transformations and your computations and your calculations on it. So what Backbone is basically it's started out as the heart of Document Cloud. So Document Cloud is the Knight Foundation project that I mentioned. That's a workspace for journalists to work with primary source documents. And so Backbone basically started out as the basic model and view layer that we had inside of Document Cloud for our sort of standard views for rendering documents, annotations, users, projects, that sort of thing, entities. So part of the deal with Document Cloud being a Knight-funded project under the News Challenge was that everything we did had to be released as open source. So during the entire process, we were trying to look at different aspects of the application and say what would be useful as a standalone library and what can we pull out and make a standalone thing that other people can use for other news projects and other projects. And so Backbone was sort of the kernel of that structure for the application, the foundation level of the structure. So that's its origins, and that's the kind of things that it helps you with. And I think that's a pretty good intro.
All right, cool. So is it really an MVC? Because I noticed that you renamed controllers to routers.
Yeah, there's been a little bit of a struggle about that, right? So you already have the Rails Django sort of back and forth about what's a view and what's a template. And so if you're a purist about it and you're looking at views as reacting to changes like click events and stuff like that, then you could probably think of Backbone views as controllers instead of views. Yeah. But I like to call them views because they're responsible for a single piece of UI. Usually they're tied very, very tightly to a DOM element and all of its contents. So in that sense, they're really, view-like. But you also have templates. So if you want to call your templates views and your views controllers, feel free.
So by the way, Jeremy, I agree that the nomenclature is a big problem in general. I think everybody wants to call themselves MVC and not call themselves MVC, and then it becomes this massive pedantic thing. I think there is a space for a controller object which is responsible for multiple elements. So Backbone defines a view as a essentially controller-like thing that is responsible for controlling one element. I think often when you get into a bigger application, you want to have an object that's responsible for multiple elements. Backbone has collections for this, but that's sort of kind of like a special case.
So on the UI side, though, I think you'd also use a view. You can also have bigger views that have multiple elements inside of them, although there isn't a different type of object for that. But yeah, so yes, I agree. It's important not to get pedantic about this, especially with MVC, right? MVC is a super broad category. There are many different types of libraries and systems that exactly. And I think that's fine. I think that as long as you have this sort of basic distinction between the UI and the model, like that's the heart of MVC, right? Even if you don't have particular pieces. Usually
there's UI, model, and then some intermediary layer. And I think in Backbone, that's the view object, usually.
I think that's fair, yeah.
Yeah, I should just follow up. I agree that often, so like what Coco would call a view controller makes sense to be a view in Backbone or Ember. But there's definitely a case where you have, I think what Backbone uses collections for, there's a more general case of that. And it's not UI, it's representing application state. It's representing something that is presented in multiple views, multiple presentation locations, but it represents application state.
So that might be a little bit fuzzy because Backbone controllers don't really have Backbone collections don't really have anything to do with UI. They're just collections of models and all of the data manipulation and aggregation functions that you want to do on your list of models. So mapping, reducing, filtering, selecting, all that kind of stuff, where you're taking a list of model objects and getting subsets.
Right.
But I would be curious to hear more about how Ember's controllers work. So I know that you guys have array controllers and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So array controllers kind of fulfill a similar. What I meant specifically was you have this array of things, and that array of things isn't really persisted. Like there is a concept of what that array is often in terms of a query, but you would never like persist that entire array to the database. So the list of items that you happen to have locally is application state, as are things like aggregates. So in a to-do list, which is the Hello World example, how many items are remaining, etc. Those things are application state. They reference things that happen to be transient in your application, but they're not view things specifically, right? They're just information that doesn't belong in the model layer because it's not really persistable. It doesn't belong in the view layer.
I think it does belong in the model layer. So I think that it's a bit of a red herring to talk about a model layer that directly is one-to-one with what happens on the server, because that's never ever the case in client-side code, right? Like that's one of the things that you need to sort of get past when you first do this, is that you're not expecting to have like a Rails-like active record base model in JavaScript where you're running arbitrary queries and it represents the entire table. First of all, because it's insecure, it's on the client side. You're not going to allow your client to make arbitrary queries against your database. And secondly, because it's impossible, right? Like there's no way you can fit your entire table across the pipe and get it into JavaScript to query against. So your client-side models represent the data and the models from the perspective of the browser and what you need to do. And that includes things like the to-do list, how many are left for this particular session, even though that collection might not be persisted back.
So I would be comfortable, I guess, if you wanted to stick the collection into the model layer. I think of it as a different thing. I think of it, there's like a bunch of objects so in my mind, the model layer maps well onto not the database tables, but onto the resources that are exposed from the server. And the controller layer is basically an intermediary that aggregates information from a bunch of models and exposes that information to the view layer. But I would be okay with someone saying that thing that you are saying is the controller layer is actually part of the model layer.
Sure, it's all one big fuzzy wishy-washy MVC soup. You can push and pull the boundaries around for sure.
I think that's the great thing about Backbone. I mean, what Backbone did was basically say, okay, we're going to take a small part of what I'm assuming you guys use for much bigger projects, and so we're gonna take this out and we're going to open source this, and this is going to be something that people can build on. That's why it's called Backbone. It's pretty empty. It's very minimal, and basically people can kind of put their own stuff on there and make it do whatever they want within the context of what they're working with. And I think that's what kind of made Backbone like really great, and that's why it's inspired a lot of things, such as Ember and such as UE3 and such as so many other frameworks that are now taking Backbone-inspired MVC stuff and putting it in there.
So the funny thing about this is that I think that this type of thing that we're talking about and that you guys talked about last week is the kind of thing that everyone who has done a big app in JavaScript has written before. It's not new at all, and a lot of the ideas in Backbone, I've seen, in earlier jobs that I've worked for, and people who have been doing this kind of thing from the early days of DHTML, like even with some of the first webmail clients and stuff like that. Those, you end up with the same sort of concepts of models and UI, and you have to wrestle with that. And so I think that a lot of JavaScript developers who've been doing it for a while have done this before, for one-off projects. And it's been really fun to see the explosion of libraries come out of the woodwork, because everyone's like, oh, when I did it this way, and I liked it better that way. So I'm going to, make my own version that works a little bit differently. And I think that's great.
Now, that's one thing that I really like about the variety that's out there too, is that you have something like Ember that is very opinionated, that it's you do it this way, and it, because it's opinionated, kind of the convention over configuration thing that you get with Rails is that you can expect it to work in a certain way, all the time, every time. And it seems like Backbone gives you a lot more options if you want to customize, configure, whatever. It just gives you the kind of the bare bones, and then you can work up from there to whatever you want. And so I think it really depends on your coding style as to which one you choose. And so people who are more used to the opinionated way of doing things that you get from something like Ember would probably be more comfortable that way. But I have a few friends that don't like some of the conventions that Ember puts in. And so they're like, yeah, if you could do something like Ember, but give me these other options over here that are kind of native built in, then, I'd be happy with that framework. And I think that's where you see a lot of these coming up. But I think it's also very encouraging that you have all these options. So you can say, I want something that, it just kind of handles everything for me. And as long as I do it the Ember way, then I'm happy. And in other cases, it's like, what? I just need a minimal model to handle this. I'm going to customize these couple of things. I'm really going to think about it this way. And so you pull Backbone in, you hook it up, it gets it up and going really quickly. It's a relatively small library compared to some of the other ones, and you're off and running. So
I want to clarify one point, which is just basically, so I've been doing convention over configuration for a long time. I consider jQuery to also be a convention over configuration type of library. One thing that I learned starting with MERB, and that I've pretty much taken with me the entire way, is that it's fine to have convention over configuration, but it is bad to build the core library as convention over configuration. In other words, the convention over configuration ideally is a light defaults layer on top. It has a very, very big impact on how people use the library. But I think the idea that convention over configuration also means that it's impossible to drop down into something different is basically a relic of like Rails 1.0 era or 2.0 era. And there are ways to strategically build a library that is very flexible under the hood. So if you actually want to go do stuff, it's fine. But ultimately, most people use the defaults. And I should be clear, I definitely think that if people are going to want to be monkeying under the hood all the time, a convention over configuration library isn't for you. But the idea that you hit a wall and then you're just stuck because Ember or Rails didn't think of something is pretty much not how it works anymore.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
So that was a nice way.
And I also want to add to that I don't think that it's just black and white. Either you're convention over configuration or you're configuration over convention. I think that there's definitely strong opinions. It's not just that Ember is opinionated and Backbone doesn't have opinions. I think both have opinions, and both have opinions about ways that other libraries do things that they disagree with or that they do agree with.
Although Backbone definitely is of the opinion in many more cases that you should not have opinions.
Yes, it does. It does try to be flexible to many different patterns and uses. That is correct.
And in the public API, everyone should do this. So Ember totally under the hood supports, for instance, alternate template engines, but the public API, the way you're supposed to use Ember is you should just use handlebars. If you want to do something else, fine. Here's how you do it. The public API, where Backbone is, we think that we should not make this decision for you at all. Go to town.
Exactly. Backbone thinks you should be able to use any template library that you.
So just to quibble, Ember also thinks you should be able to use any template language you like, but we think that there's a win in saying, here's the one that we support well, that has a lot of integration. If you use it, you get additional wins. If you don't want to, that's fine, but you lose all the extra win.
You lose all the extra stuff, and you're also not using a large part of what Ember gives you, right? You'd probably be ignoring 50% of the code base of Ember that you're including on the page if you didn't use handlebars, right?
So you would probably, in that case, rip out. So again, this is definitely, I think, in terms of how people use it, This is not what we would tell people. But you could rip out the Ember handlebars library, which is bundled in, ship everything else, and then roll your own templating layer. And that would, from the perspective of all the modules that come with Ember, that would be fine. The view layer doesn't care about Ember at all, handlebars at all. The view layer just cares about an object that's a function that takes a context and returns a string.
Right. So
I've been involved in a fair few discussions regarding refactoring of what you might call like legacy applications to be more responsive. You will use more in terms of responsive UIs. And what I found is that people are a little bit more. They find Backbone by itself easier to reason about because that it is that flexible. So they can just say, okay, we're going to take this small minimal piece, start from there, and start to kind of jury rig our existing code into that and see what happens after that. Whereas something UE3 or Ember or whatever, it's a little bit like there's more of a feel of we have to go whole hog on this. And so there are a lot more people that have to be on board, and there's a lot more that has to be read and kind of be reasoned about to be able to integrate that.
I would quibble with that, but
sure. I mean,
well, maybe we can get more specific instead of just feels easier or doesn't feel easier. Like if we already talked about templates.
Yeah, I mean, the lovely thing about JavaScript is that it is so flexible, right? I mean, when you go in and override anything, you basically go in and make anything do whatever you want. It doesn't really matter if it's Ember or something else. I mean, of course you can because it's JavaScript. Right?
So I would go beyond. I mean, obviously that's true, but like if you want to go use jQuery and like drop in a different strategy for doing document fragments, no, you cannot. Where Ember is actually built on the idea of like there's the core runtime, there's the Mitson system, there's the view layer, there's handlebars, there's a state library, there's data, and those all things build on each other. So I think it is a different thing than saying JavaScript is a flexible language. Of course, you could do anything from saying Ember specifically has parts of the system that do not care about the template layer. And that is an intentional part of the public API.
So speaking of the templating layer, since we're starting there, I've wanted to ask Yehuda how he finds folks reacting to the pattern of basically encoding some logic. So handlebars is somewhat logicless templates, right? It takes inspiration from Mustache, but in conjunction with Ember, especially, you end up putting basically logic into your attribute tags in a very codified way so that Ember can understand what the particular piece of DOM represents in terms of the JavaScript model. So as opposed to having HTML that knows nothing about, basically knows nothing about what your JavaScript model is, right? Inside your Ember views, you sort of expose it and you can see what hooks up to what. How do you find folks reacting to that?
So first of all, handlebars is absolutely a compromise. It's a compromise between arbitrary code and no code. But the basic idea is that the quote-unquote code, the parts of logic that are in there are designed to be very declarative. So the only things that you're supposed to be putting into a handlebars template in Ember, and we do a decent job of enforcing this in terms of what we expose by default, are declarative things. So an example is we have computed properties, and so any logic, if you want to say like a conditional, you never say if foo and bar or baz. You always say if a single property, and then the logic for what that property means goes into your JavaScript code, right? So I think it's useful, and people find it useful to be able to have conditionals that automatically update, loops that automatically update, but to limit what is in that code to things that are declarative and that we can observe and analyze and say, okay, here is how we need to get this on the screen and update it later.
All right. So this is something that I've got feelings about too, like the templating. I really don't get the whole handlebars thing, other than that, people are coming from PHP, so they want some sort of tag identifier. Like, my argument is, why not use what the DOM provides? So you've got class names in there that you can use semantically, so why not use those instead of putting in some handlebars brackets that then have to get parsed and then turned into a span tag that has that class name anyway?
That's a great question, and I've actually worked with some libraries in the past where everything was DOM based, right? So basically, you do it from JavaScript, right? So you'd be working in your JavaScript view, you'd be building up what the HTML looks like, but every single call that you made would basically be a document.create element call, and it was all done in terms of the DOM. And so that's an interesting approach. One of the big problems you run into, first off, is that it's about the slowest way you can possibly render UI in JavaScript is to do it all with the DOM. And that for better or for worse, generating strings of HTML and then evaluating them all at once is about the fastest way that you could do UI in JavaScript. And so if you're doing anything performance intensive, and again, this is partly with older browsers because you can do pretty crazy things in Chrome and Firefox these days. But if you have to have it work in IE8 or IE7, you're going to run into limits if you try to use a DOM-only approach and you're trying to render 1,000 elements and update it quickly. So that's one of the main things.
I think there's another point, which is if you actually go look at, so there are other libraries that tell you that make the exact argument that you're making, and the end result looks exactly like handlebars, except way more verbose because you have all the XML cruft, right? So you have things that are loops. You have UL, a UL is a loop, and the UL inside of it essentially has exactly the same thing as what handlebars has, except as Jeremy points out, you now have to go find it in the DOM and manually do DOM work. And it looks, there's data for each, right? Instead of being able to say pound each, you have to say UL data for each. So you end up with conceptually, abstraction wise, exactly the same thing, except it's a lot more verbose.
Right.
What I really like about Mustache is that, or handlebars, is that it's so similar to Mustache. So you can also use it server side. Mustache is implemented in almost all server languages. So you can have server side templating and use the same templates in the client as well. Of course, with Node.js, that becomes a non-issue. But
with a web app,
that ends up becoming maybe, I don't know if Yehuda will let me say this, but a handlebars dirty secret, right? Which is that if you're doing anything interesting in a handlebars template, you're going to have your own helper functions, and your helper functions are both sophisticated and implemented in a particular language, which is going to be JavaScript in this case.
So it's not a dirty secret. It's the whole thing is a pipe dream to begin with.
Right. So he doesn't even think it should be done. Right. So if you have a nice, and we have this actually here at the Times, if you have a nice big handlebars application, you probably cannot render it in a different language. You probably have to run JavaScript on the server if you want to render it without.
So there is one window. So I could imagine the fact that the helpers are separate means that you could still use the same templates and re-implement the helpers in Ruby or whatever. Again, I think the Node is awesome because did you know if you write in JavaScript, you write the same code on the client and server, and if you use Mustache, you use the same template. I think the entire thing is a pipe dream. People are missing the context of what a client-side app and a server-side app is, and thinking about it very superficially. So the end result is you imagine that something is cool. By now, shouldn't Node have done something cool? Like, shouldn't there be a demo of something really awesome happening? I think the fact is that there's just a totally different context for what you're doing on the server than the client.
Well, I don't understand.
If you look at some of the UE3 demos, for example, right? UE3 and UE2, they have some really heavy JavaScript widgets, right? And because UE3 can run on the Node.js server, it can render those JS widgets on the server, send them over as HTML, for example, for web mobile browsers or otherwise, less powerful interfaces, and you can then load the JS on the client behind the scenes.
So I think I would echo Jeremy's dirty secret. I think in practice, I think it probably demos well, but I would easily imagine that actually trying to do it in practice will result in having to have mega constraints that are not obvious, right? So you actually can't run any code that would be caring about client-side state at all.
All right, I'm going to.
For the record, I'm still a believer in this pipe dream, and I don't think that Node is necessarily there yet in terms of library support for doing everything that you needed to do on the server side. But I do think that there is, especially for JavaScript web applications, value in being able to have the same code run on the client and the server, even if it's still not really, even if we haven't really reached that point yet. And I think this happens even on a daily basis. So this afternoon, I'm trying to get together a little widget that's going to show the current state of the Republican primary and who's got how many delegates for a section front on NY Times. And we want it now, so we want to be able to update it client side because we want it to be live, and we want it to always be able to pull from the JavaScript API the latest state of the race, but we also want to be able to bake it into the page server side to fit in the CMS and to have all the links in that thing be indexed by Google. So I have this kind of funky hybrid template right now where half of the UI and the pieces that are links and that are and we want to be indexed by Google are being done in an ERB template, and there's also a client-side template to make the API call and update the client-side bit. And it's a little bit, step 2 feet, 1 foot in each world, and it doesn't need to be.
So I'm willing to be convinced on the pipe dream, but I want us to be honest about where we are today.
Right.
Yes, today it's hard.
I was going to ask, so the benefits of doing it on the server instead of just always doing all of your templating on the client forever, are...
Google is the most obvious.
Yeah, I was going to say it's mostly for crawling,
Caching.
right? And then what Joaquin said?
But if you're doing a web app,
it's basically the initial load, right? You save a lot of time on the initial load, because if you have a heavy JS web app and you have an empty cache situation, then all of a sudden you have to load whatever, half a meg of JavaScript before you even see something. Whereas in this other way, you can load a very thin HTML representation of that and then start loading the half meg of JS.
But it can't do anything. So in most cases, the fact that HTML can't actually do anything makes it not
No,
useful.
but it can't. There is no reason why it can't do anything. Right?
if you don't have your JavaScript yet.
No, so when it loads first, right? Then what it does is it hooks up in a plain old get, right? So basically you click on something and you send a get request and you get a new page until the JavaScript comes in and hooks up those buttons to the Ajax-powered interface.
So let's say you're on a mobile device and you go to a page, and that page goes and downloads whatever you want to look at. And it takes 10 seconds or 15 seconds to download the 500K of JavaScript that are needed to actually power the page. There is an argument that the fact that you can't actually do the fact that the page will appear broken during that time, maybe...
No, but it won't appear broken.
It will, because you'll try to do things that you are normally allowed to do on the page, and they won't work because you have no JavaScript.
No, but they will work because it will have interfaces that aren't JavaScript reliant.
Okay, so I guess if you build your entire app is built as though it was a regular non-JavaScript controlled app, perhaps that could work. I would love to see someone actually advocate that and in detail, because that's, in my mind, that's pretty crazy, right? You're basically saying that
people do advocate that. That's the full-on progressive enhancement sort of standpoint. But the kind of JavaScript apps that we're talking about here don't really work that way, right? Like, it's not realistic.
Jeremy, that's my point. It's not that people don't advocate it in the abstract. My point is that most people who build single-page apps that are serious already have abandoned this pipe dream.
Absolutely.
No.
Well, I don't understand.
Listen.
Just let the user take 10 seconds to download it the first time. I mean, what's the big deal?
I think
because they'll go somewhere else. If they have to wait 10 seconds for a page to load, they'll go like...
But they'll also go somewhere else if you download something and then you have to wait 15 seconds and the page is broken.
No, but listen. Okay, imagine what we were talking about before, right? You have Ember.js in the client, and that has a controller, model view, and all that shit, right? Then also imagine that you have Node.js in the background, and you have a layer that translates these things from Ajax to normal post get interfaces. And that's what it renders on the server side. It serves that, and then once it serves that in the client, and you get the JS libs, then that JS stuff goes in and changes those links to be fully Ajax powered. It's so not broken.
That means that you need to have you basically need to have a full HTML you need to basically go back to progressive enhancement. Every single page, every single UI state that you want has to be able to be rendered on the server as HTML, and the server has to know what the state is.
So this is actually one of the
abstraction layer.
Right, exactly. This is one of the reasons why it's fun that everyone is pursuing their own style of client-side application framework, because it would be great to have someone who takes that idea to the extreme and creates a library where sort of all of the things that you can express, you're only allowed to express things that can be done on both, and that can be expressed in terms of get, post, basically just get and post of forms, as well as the JavaScript enhanced equivalents, and then see how well that works out.
So I think something like Seaside would probably be necessary to make it work well. But so Jeremy, correct me if I'm wrong, but I will articulate that I personally would not want to build this app. And
I would concur with you. Yes.
This is it seems
okay. I'm going to turn the bus here a little bit. We did bring Jeremy on to talk about Backbone, and we've kind of gone off of a tangent, and it's really interesting to see where this is going, and that's why I'm happy to listen. But at the same time, I do want our listeners to kind of get an idea of what Backbone's about, and we've talked about some of it. I'm a little curious as to what you see as the strengths of Backbone, Jeremy.
What do I see as the strengths? Basically, if readers are curious and we want to talk about strengths, I think the one thing that constantly inspires and amazes me all the time is that basically Backbone's only been out there for a little bit over a year. I think it was October, what would that be? 2010 that we launched it. And in that incredibly short amount of time, if you go to backbonejs.org and scroll down through the examples, there have been a ridiculous amount of amazing apps in all different contexts that have been built with it. Most of them I don't know anything about until they launch or weeks or months after. And people are using it for, for sort of native / web hybrid experiences on phones. If you're LinkedIn or SoundCloud, people use it for, large, sophisticated desktop style web apps. People use it for web page galleries. People are using it for payment processor management systems. It's in an in-game browser inside of a 3D shoot 'em up. It's being used in a desktop app that's being powered by Node.js for building maps. It's sort of found all these really fascinating nooks and crannies, and all these people using it in different ways. Some of which are actually pursuing the pipe dream of using Backbone models, the same model code on the server side in Node and on the client side in the browser. So I think that's strength number 1 through 10 at least.
Okay, so I have one other question for you, and this is just something that I've noticed in using Backbone myself, and that is let's say that I have a website and I have kind of a main content, and then I have a sidebar content. And so let's say that I click something in the main content that has a list of, I don't know, posts. Let's say it's a Twitter app. So they're like Twitter posts or tweets. And so I click something else because I have a menu over there, and it loads a different set of tweets over on the right side. And I have the option to change something on the right side. Those are 2 different collections, the way that I have it implemented. And so when I change something on the right side, it doesn't reflect on the left side. Is there a good way of handling that, or is that something that isn't just that
Sure.
It's not made to handle, or...
No, there's definitely good ways of handling that. So ideally, if the idea with modeling something, right, whether it's in a database relationally or client side in terms of objects, is that you have one place to go look at the model and one source of state for that model, right? You don't have 2 different rows in your database, one of which is when the thing is looked at through a certain lens, and another one is when it's looked at through a different lens. Because then if you change one, the other one doesn't get updated. And
Right.
It's really the same principle on the client side. So ideally, if you have 2 different tweets, but it's the same tweet, that should be one model. And when you make a change to that model, it can be in both collections, and both collections will have that change event, and both views will re-render off of those collections. So maybe instead of just 2 collections, one for each for the left and one for the right, you end up with 3, right? And the first one is where the canonical source of all of your tweets are. And then the 2 just look into that and pull tweets out, and maybe they're sharing sometimes.
Okay, so that makes sense. So does anyone else have questions about Backbone? We have a few minutes before we have to get to the picks.
Maybe Yehuda's got some questions.
I don't really have any questions. So I guess the main thing that I think that is different between something like Backbone or Sinatra in Ruby and something like Ember or Rails is what you do when patterns become conventional. And I think Sinatra and Backbone take the approach of that is the community's job. Please feel free to write plugins, write extensions, write blog posts, put up backbonepatterns.com. But we're basically done. We have scoped out the problem, and if there's obvious things that a lot of people are doing, go to town, but that's not in scope. Where Rails and Ember say, okay, over time, people are adding different patterns. People are using these patterns. Let's try to make it so you don't have to personally find it on your own. And I guess, first of all, am I characterizing it correctly, or would you?
No, I don't think you need to draw that parallel, right? Like Sinatra and Backbone are not the same thing, and Rails and Ember are not the same thing. They're 4 different projects, and they approach things differently. And I'd be glad to describe what I think the Backbone approach would be to pulling in patterns and plugins, which would be that if it's something that is useful for 80 or 90% of the apps out there, then we should absolutely be doing it. So that's true both in terms of the basic utility functions on collections. Like not everyone is going to use, I don't even know what these things are, right? Not everyone is going to use sum and shuffle and sorted index and group by and sort by and every and reject and include and all those kinds of convenience array functions. Not all apps are going to need that, but they're going to be handy for most people. So we include them because it's easy to do, and they're also small and lightweight. And so that's why it's something that we think is a good idea for Backbone. But I don't think But if it's something that might be useful for 30% of apps, but is a big heavy change, then yes, that shouldn't be rolled in.
So a good parallel would be REST in Rails. So there's actually like a third thing here. The elephant in the room, which is sometimes you discover patterns, and if you make them a core thing, they become a thing that everyone uses. So jQuery added deferreds under this idea. This is a good pattern. We think this is a good idea. If we put it in, it will be the canonical choice for 80 or 90% of people.
So that is the elephant in the room, and I think that has much less to do with engineering than it does with personal taste, right? It may or may not be, a good pattern, and it may or may not be good for some group of people, but that's sort of, you can't really answer that question, right?
So I agree that Rails has everything to do with DHH's personal taste, but at the end of the day, what you name your actions in a controller doesn't matter enough to not have a default, right? Giving people an answer so they don't have to think about it is a bigger win than saying, you might not agree with DHH, so feel free to name it whatever you want.
Right.
Okay.
All right. So one other thing that I wanted to do before we got into the picks was we did get an email a little bit ago, and that was from Jonathan Mahoney. And it looks like he's got a .eu address, so he's over in Europe somewhere. He said, you've mentioned Backbone several times, which is my MV Star framework of choice when building web apps. However, there are two projects I think deserve a mention when discussing Backbone. There's Backbone Model Binding and Backbone Marionette, both by Derek Bailey. The first adds knockout.js style data bindings, and the second adds a really nice abstraction layer for forming composite applications. And this kind of led me into another question. Have you seen a lot of people adding things to Backbone sort of outside of the main tree, I guess?
Yes, absolutely, and that's how it's supposed to work. So the idea is, if you're doing a large app built on Backbone, you will probably start with Backbone. You may end up making your own base class that adds, special functionality that you need for your app. Maybe that's local storage, like sort of right through local storage caching. Maybe that's a WebSocket backend instead of the default sort of jQuery.ajax REST backend. Maybe that's sophisticated nested views. Maybe that's a client server thing. So yes, I think that there's lots of people doing that inside of their own applications, and there's also people who have been generous enough to share their extras with the community by doing extensions.
Huh. All right.
And if you're asking about those extensions specifically, we can get into that too.
Have you used them?
I haven't used them for projects. But the whole data binding topic is an interesting one, because that is one of the main distinguishing points in philosophy between Backbone and Ember about how bindings should be treated.
All right, Jameson, were you going to say something?
I was just going to ask if there's a defined architecture for writing add-ons to Backbone, or do people kind of just roll it however they want?
No, so it's a pretty small library. Like, there's not really anything. So the entire source is annotated with the explicit idea that you should be, feeling free if something's not working to dig in and figure out how it works, and also to dig in and override things if you find the need. So there really isn't much in the source and in the API that's not public. I think we actually got rid of a few more private methods. I think it's the case that 95% of the methods inside all the different Backbone classes are public, and thus suitable for overriding if you need different behavior. So basically the whole thing is a public API.
Yeah, I should mention that is essentially true about Ember, except that fewer people do it. Right. So I think the general idea of build your entire library in a way that the APIs that are exposed are thought through well enough so that if someone wants to override them, there's a clear path to doing so, is clearly a good idea. Yeah,
and that it won't break anything else, right? And also that there's hooks. So in terms of Backbone, one of the ways that happens is with sync. So so in terms of persisting your data to the server, people have really, interesting requirements, right? Like, maybe you have the ability to control what the server tells you, but maybe you don't. So Backbone gives you hooks so that you can add a parse method. So whenever you get server-side data, you have an opportunity to translate it before it gets turned into model objects. You have the ability to override the sync function, which is what gets the single function that gets called every time you try to save a change to the server, both at the individual model level and at the collection level. So you can say all of my collections are backed by my main Rails app, except for this one that goes over to the Twitter API and this other one that goes over to my credit card processor. And so those two collections, I'm going to change the sync function to go to a different place and to behave in a different way. So there are lots of hooks sort of in there, and people are actually adding more all the time for things like that.
And I definitely agree that if you think things through that way in the first place, you end up with, it's a lot easier for people who come up with an unexpected thing to do what they need to do. I do not consider that a distinction between Backbone and Ember. I think that's just good architecture.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and get into the picks. Let's start with Jameson.
So my first pick is Matt Might's blog. He's a I think he's a professor at the University of Utah. He teaches programming languages, but his blog posts are amazing. Some of them get very academic. If you don't care about the in-depth topic of programming languages, then you might want to skip some of them. But he has some great ones about just like Unix patterns, different shell utilities. His blog is great. So that's my first pick. My second pick is Adi Osmani. Is that how you say his name? I don't know. He's a JavaScript guy at AOL, and he did a series of videos called Scaling JavaScript Applications. They just got put up on Vimeo a couple weeks ago, and he talks a lot about different paradigms of organizing your JavaScript code for beyond just the store everything in the DOM, like Jeremy talked about. So it's about an hour long, spread across these 3 videos. He talks a lot about the different frameworks and a lot about the underlying principles as well. So it's not just like how to use Backbone, but it's what are the ideas that went into Backbone and other frameworks as well. So I'll link to those, but those are great. They're well worth an hour of your time to watch.
All right, cool. AJ, what are your picks?
So first off, the site that we use for our feedback, uservoice.com. I was really pleased with them when I asked them if the Utah JS user group could have a full account, and they have a promo code for all people that are doing nonprofit type stuff. So I thought that was really cool, and they've got a nice service. So I want to give a shout out to them for that. And also, apparently there was a music video that went on around the time of the Super Bowl by OK Go, and it was very reminiscent of this video I saw before for a phone commercial. And they're both very interesting because they use unconventional methods to make music. And so I've got the YouTube link that I'll share, but the commercial for the phone is called NTT Docomo. It's the wooden phone, and they have a ball that rolls through the forest like a mile long on different blocks that make different sounds as it rolls down this hill.
That's sweet. So it's like a Rube Goldberg type thing.
Yeah, it's like Rube Goldberg with music. And then OK Go had one too, but I didn't think it was as original because other people have been doing stuff since that one.
All right. Yehuda, what are your picks?
So I have two picks, 2.5 picks. First of all, es5.github.com. It's the annotated ECMAScript 5.1 spec, and I think people in general should probably read specs more than they do. Obviously, it's not like a noob thing, but I think people wait till far too late in their development leveling up to go read specs. So those are my 2 picks today. es5.github.com is an annotated ECMAScript spec with a lot of interesting annotations, and I would recommend reading it front to back one day. And the other one is the HTML5 spec author view. That's this guy. And that's basically a version of the spec without the algorithms. So there's what a web browser needs to do in order to implement the cache, for instance. And that's interesting, perhaps could be a useful thing to read. But most of the time, you just want a good, clear description of what the feature is. And I think with the algorithms out, it's easier to read the whole HTML5 spec front to back. So I do this on a regular basis, and I would recommend people do. And in the HTML5 spec, you can actually subscribe to changes for specific parts. So if you're really interested in Canvas, you can do a subscription to changes in Canvas. I think that's one of the sections. And that's cool if you're just trying to become notified if there are changes. And then not a pick, but kudos to Google for releasing Chrome for Android. That actually excites me a lot.
All right. Joaquin, what are your picks?
Well, I didn't really pick any before, but one of the things I've been spending on a lot of time on the last few weeks has been PhoneGap, which is kind of interesting. And PhoneGap is, I'm pretty sure many of you know it, but it's basically an abstraction layer that gives you native functionality from JavaScript HTML apps that you run within iPhone or Android phones or whatever. And it's pretty interesting. Nitobi, the company behind it, just got purchased by Adobe and IBM and Microsoft, and a lot of other companies are putting a lot of resources into getting it more stable. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there, I find. Yeah,
PhoneGap, I think, was also accepted into the Apache Foundation. So
That's right. And there's a lot of work going on there with the now they renamed to Callback, and then they renamed to Cordova. And so there's a lot of there's a lot of bureaucracy going on right now. But hopefully they get stable the next few weeks or months.
Yeah, I think
that's
that's
where projects go to die.
Yeah, I know.
It depends. I went to ApacheCon this fall, and the incubator is kind of an interesting program because they basically have to go in and make sure that it will line up with the Apache license, and so that's why you see them changing names and doing all this other stuff, is because they're trying to avoid any collisions with copyrights, trademarks, and any proprietary or whatever software. So, all right.
Well, I mean, I love the idea of it. I mean, we web developers, I think we're blessed. Our stuff runs everywhere, and now it can run like a few more places as well, and get better access to native components. Yeah.
All right. Cool. All right. Well, I'll go ahead and put up a couple of picks. The first one is I was listening to a podcast. It's the South Geek Ramble and Review, and anyway, the first 3 minutes were actually the sound from a video that I found on YouTube, and the video is Gmail Man, and it's actually a Microsoft commercial, but it's pretty funny. And so I'll go ahead and share that because I was laughing for a while about that one. And then one other thing, I've been working out and count my calories so that I can get my diabetes under control. And I've been using a system. It's called MyFitnessPal, and it really is just that. It's a calorie counter, and you can also track your workouts on it. And so I've been putting them in there, and I've also been putting them up on the dailymile.com or dailymile.com. And so I've really been enjoying those. As far as technical picks go, I'm going to pick one that everybody uses, but every time I use it, I'm just impressed with everything that goes into it, and that's jQuery. So I'm just going to give them a plug because I think they're really cool.
I'm going to pick computers next week. I pick computers.
Oh, thanks.
Computers are awesome.
Yeah, I use one on occasion.
You guys are all wrong. Technology's the best.
All right. Jeremy, what are your picks?
This is the first I'm hearing of it, so I will pick one to match Yehuda's, which is the ES Discuss mailing list on mail.mozilla.org is a woefully underread mailing list where all the folks who are working on the next version of JavaScript talk about basically what it's going to be and why it should be certain ways and the things that they don't like and they're going to try to fix. So if you're doing any kind of JavaScript work at all and you're interested in where the language is heading, it's a must read, or at least to catch up on, a couple times a month and skim through the new topics.
And I have a question about that.
Sure.
What if you're not a programming language expert, or you feel intimidated by all the academia that goes on? Is there either a good introduction to those topics or a more digestible summary?
No, although that would be good for someone to write. It's pretty much the nitty gritty of what they're working on. So usually that means you don't need to be an expert. They're not talking about super arcane stuff. It's like, everyone has trouble with, function statements versus function expressions versus name function expressions. And although maybe that does sound a little bit intimidating, but like a function statement is, and then when you assign a function to a variable. And so they're talking about, when that breaks and when it works well and that kind of thing.
Okay.
And I nice thing about what they're doing is that like every kind of proposal has to have a working script or has to have like a code examples of how it's going to work in real life. So it is kind of accessible. You can kind of see like, okay, well, this is what I would have to be working with in the future if this goes forward. I definitely agree more people should be reading it and should be chiming in.
And I also say a lot of people complain a lot about like, I don't know what's going on. These guys are just doing stuff behind smoke-filled rooms. And it's actually, as far as I can tell, there aren't a lot of smoke-filled rooms. There are definitely some decisions that get made out of the public eye, but there's a ton of opportunity for people to provide feedback. And I think the standards bodies really want that. Like I spent a bunch of time contributing and people were excited about that. So for people out there who have time and are interested in participating in the future of the web, there is a way to do that and you should do it.
Besides, you only get smoke-filled rooms when something's on fire. So
this is a good point.
All right.
Awesome.
So we'll wrap this up real quick. Couple of business items first. If you go to JavaScriptJabber. Is it JavaScriptJabber.uservoice.com or JSJabber?
Unknown.
JSJabber.
jsjabber.uservoice.com. You can suggest topics for us. That's something that we really appreciate because then we know what you want to hear about. One other thing is that we are in iTunes. So if you go to iTunes, you can subscribe there. You can also leave us a review. If you do subscribe and you do leave us a review, that really helps us out because it kind of helps bring us to the top of the list when people are looking for JavaScript stuff. So go ahead and do that. If you're listening on some other device, I do have a subscribe link up there. And so, go ahead and subscribe on that just off of the RSS feed.